most people think of Jewish ethnic foods, what comes to mind are things like bagels and lox, matzo ball soup, pastrami sandwich, things that are associated with Eastern European or Ashkenazi Jews. Those are typical Jewish foods, typically, particularly in New York, area where I live. I was surprised to discover, however, even among my non-Jewish friends who grew up in New York, which is pretty cosmopolitan, that they were quite unfamiliar with kugels, that category of baked puddings, also associated with the Eastern European Jews, that can involve anything from noodles to rice to potatoes to carrots. What characterizes it is that it's a baked pudding, a sort of a custardy mix that may or may not have dairy products in it, depending on how it's going to be used. My all-time favorite is noodle pudding, or in Yiddish they would call it Kugel. Kugel noodle pudding, the same thing. The problem with the traditional noodle pudding is that it's very rich, particularly in its dairy version. You look at recipes that call for lots of butter and sour cream, which is delicious, but doesn't make it your everyday fare. What I'm going to show you how to do is to make a noodle pudding that rivals the best of the best, and yet is actually healthful, made with nutritious ingredients, low enough in fat to be healthful, but not so low in fat as to be inedible. And what's the point of making something that's really healthful if nobody wants to eat it because it tastes so bad? Right, I'm going to walk you through it step by step, and it's really a very easy procedure. It's also one of these forgiving procedures. In the interest of clarity, I'm going to use real cups, but when I do it in my own kitchen with nobody watching, I'm likely to measure with my hands, which would be the old-fashioned way. All right, to start off with, I cooked up 8 ounces of whole wheat egg noodles. You can use regular egg noodles, that's typical, but the whole wheat actually worked very nicely. And while the noodles were cooking, I melted 2 tablespoons of butter in this pan, which is approximately a 9 by 13 pan. The actual shape doesn't matter. If you use a smaller pan, it'll be thicker, a larger pan, it'll be thinner. It will still be noodle pudding. All right, I mixed it together. And then, now I'm going to add 2 apples that I've peeled and cut in medium thick chunks. I used Fuji apples for this. You can use any apple you want, but I would suggest that you stay away from Red Delicious, which are tasteless, and Macintosh, which tend to turn to mush. Now I'm going to add a cup of raisins. I use the regular raisins. If you like golden raisins, you could use those as well. These raisins came out of the bag soft. If yours are a little hard, you might want to soak them in a little orange juice, which is nice. All right, now, they're all in here, and the next thing you do is you mix it up. And I found for things like this, nothing beats hands. All right, so here's your basic mixture that is going to wait for its nice creamy topping. So let me set this aside until we're ready for the topping. I've also preheated my oven to 350 degrees. Let me just go get this off my hands and we'll continue. For the topping, to make this less caloric, I've substituted for sour cream low-fat cottage cheese. My very favorite low-fat cottage cheese is the Friendship 1% cottage cheese. This is a Breakstone's 2% cottage cheese, but any cottage cheese that tastes nice can be used. And the lower fat, of course, will give you a low-fat product. So this goes in here. Let me get a spatula. I'm going to add half a cup of milk. I happen to be using skim milk, but this is up to you. You can make it more or less rich depending on your preference. I'm adding 1/3 cup of packed brown sugar. You can use white sugar if you like. I never tried it with honey or maple syrup. That would be untraditional, but probably fine. And if you like it a little sweeter, you could go up to 1/2 cup. But I like it a little less sweet. And that's packed, so it should come out in a nice clump. A little bit of salt for balance. And about a teaspoon of vanilla. Now, you have another choice point here. Let me get my eggs. If cholesterol is an issue, you can make this with egg whites. When I used to make more yellow cakes for my cake customers, I would save the egg whites and freeze them, and then use it for noodle pudding. Now that I no longer have cake customers, I don't have my supply of egg whites, so you can use whole eggs. So it's 4 large whole eggs or 8 egg whites. Now these happen to be jumbo, so I'm going to use 3 of them. Again, it's a loose recipe, so a little more egg, a little less egg, doesn't really matter. That's 1. I learned from somebody that if you break eggs on their side rather than on a rim, you're less likely to get shell. And even though it sounds strange, it really works. And by breaking them directly in here, I'm probably violating every food and cooking recommendation there is. Because if shell got in there, then I'd have to go fishing through it, and that would be a mess. Now, I wouldn't suggest doing this if you don't have a food processor or blender or something like this, because you want to get everything pureed, and you don't want lumps of cottage cheese. You want to get basically a nice custard mix. Right, the mix is now completed, and it's a nice creamy mixture. Here, I don't want to tip it and spill it all over the counter. And now what I'm going to do is to pour it over the noodles that I've prepared. So let me bring those over here. Recover my spatula. And I'm going to pour it over, being careful with this particular mixer not to let the blade drop in. But if you have a food processor, you know how to use it, you know what safety precautions to take. At this point, I'm going to scrape off the blade and get the last of the mixture out of my work bowl. If you don't own a soft rubber spatula, then get yourself a couple. They're absolutely invaluable, and really the only way to get the last of good mixtures that are left in bowls. You really don't want to waste any of this good stuff. And even though it violates rules again, I like to taste it, which goes back to the time that I made a noodle pudding and forgot the sugar. So sometimes, even though you're not supposed to eat raw eggs, I take a little taste just to be sure. All right, now, the final mixing. If you have kids who like to cook, wash their hands and let them just dig in. What you're trying to do is to distribute the moist mix over the noodles so that you won't have dry places, and to make sure the fruit is distributed evenly so that everyone will get equal amounts of fruit and noodles and raisins in their portion. Make sure that the liquid is there so it won't be dry. Basic stuff. All right, when you're satisfied that it's mixed, to give it a topping of cinnamon sugar. I happen to be using Penzi cinnamon sugar, which is a nice blend, but you can make your own by mixing cinnamon and sugar in the proportions that depend on how much cinnamon you like. Or you can sprinkle sugar over it, then cinnamon, or you can leave it off if you don't like it, but I think it adds a nice touch. Now I found if I baked it uncovered, the noodles on top would get too crunchy. If I baked it covered, it wouldn't get crunchy enough. So I compromised. I'm going to put it in the oven and give it 30 minutes with the foil over it. At the end of 30 minutes, I'm going to remove the foil and give it another 20 minutes without it, and that will crisp it up. And I will see you in about 50 minutes, and we'll take it out, and I'll show you what the finished noodle pudding looks like. See you then. The timer just went off, which marks the end of the 20-minute period with the foil off. Remember, I gave it 30 minutes at 350 degrees, covered with foil. Then I gave it an additional 20 minutes to crisp up the top. And now let's take it out, and I'll show you what it looks like. As you can see, it's browned nicely, it's crisp on top. The liquid has been all absorbed. It'll look a little loose because of the butter that's going to settle in. All right, but 50 minutes is more than ample. And you let it cool just a little bit, but it doesn't have to cool too much. And you might say, well, what do you do with a noodle pudding? Is it a meal? Is it a snack? It's basically whatever you want to make out of it. Traditionally, it could be a dairy meal, and because of the eggs and the cottage cheese in it, it's certainly nutritious. You could use it for breakfast. It's good with tea. It's good just as an afternoon snack or as part of a light lunch. You really make of it what you want, and it will freeze. When you defrost it, it's a pretty good idea to do it in the toaster oven so that it doesn't get soggy. We are 2 people here in my house, and we can't go through this fast enough, so usually we eat about half of it and freeze the rest. So now you know what a Lakshan kugel looks like, but if you want to know what it tastes like, you're just going to have to follow my recipe and make it yourself. Enjoy.